Test. Okay. And then we're going to 12:01, so we give it like 30 seconds.
Oh, yeah. No, I was at a public TV station.
Yeah, people are here.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Arden Cook, and I'll be the forum host for today's conversation. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and engage in civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. This forum is titled The History and Legacy of Fort Douglas and is presented as part of the University of Utah's Veterans Day programming. Today's discussion comes after the University of Utah and the U.S. Army Reserve announced a historic land transfer and relocation agreement earlier this year. Following the relocation of the U.S. Army Reserve, the historic Fort Douglas property will be transferred to the University of Utah for future campus development. Today, we are excited to be joined by Mr. Fred Esplin, whose 42-year tenure at the University of Utah may give him some perspective on today's topic. He will share with us an overview of the shared history of Fort Douglas and the University of Utah. As Fred will explain, the university is greatly indebted to Fort Douglas for the beautiful campus we enjoyed today. Fred is a native of southern Utah. Having grown up in a cattle ranching family as an undergraduate student at SUU, he served as a White House intern during the Nixon administration. Following his graduate studies at the U, he worked in D.C. for several years at the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, before moving to Pennsylvania, where he worked for the Pennsylvania Public Television Network. He returned to Utah in 1979 to become the general manager of KUED Television, now PBS Utah. In 1999, he became the U's vice president responsible for community, alumni, and government relations, as well as marketing and oversight at the U's public radio and TV stations and Red Butte Garden. He spent the last 12 years of his career with the U as Vice President for Institutional Advancement. In retirement, Fred writes articles on Southern Utah history, teaches a course on Utah history at the U's Osher Institute, and serves on the board of the Salt Lake Tribune. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Esplin as today's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Arden. It's good to be with you today. It's been a while since I've been on the U campus, so I'm pleased to be here with you. And you'll dim the lights a little bit for the PowerPoint. So by way of introduction, I'm strongly of the opinion that to understand the present, we have to know a little bit about the past. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the shared history of Fort Douglas and the University of Utah. Because the University of Utah would not exist where it does were it not for an Irish immigrant army officer named Patrick Connor. Because in 1862, he chose this 10,000-acre site in the foothills overlooking Salt Lake City, which ultimately became our campus. And that's the story I'm going to tell you. It clearly, as you know, is one of the most beautiful campuses in the country. How many of you, either currently or during your time at the U, have lived on campus? So a great many of you have. Well, you can thank Patrick Connor for that, because the land where you're living and the land where you study is because of him. So I need to give you a little bit of context, and let's start with the university. And Utah history is of necessity Mormon history. Hope you're okay with that. They're so intertwined you can't separate them. So let's begin. The valley was settled by European settlers in 1847. Of course, the native people were here for centuries before, but that's when the European settlers arrived. And it was part of Mexico at the time the Mormons arrived. With the defeat of Mexico in 1848, Utah was made a U.S. territory. The Mormons preferred to call it Deseret, but the name Utah, in honor of the Ute Indian tribe is how it ultimately became named. Brigham Young, president of the LDS Church, was named governor, and his fellow LDS leaders in the church were made legislators and other leaders. It was a village. This is a etching of Salt Lake City in 1853. And the University of Utah's predecessor was called the University of Deseret. It was established in Salt Lake City in 1850. It was modeled on the University of Nauvoo in Illinois, where the Mormons had immigrated from. The students, when they first took classes, took them in the John Pack House in downtown Salt Lake City. And if you want to go up to This Is the Place State Park, there's a rebuilt example of what that house was like. It was very much a modest affair. The first president was a man named Orson Spencer. He had been the president of the University of Deseret as well, Nauvoo, and he was an honors graduate from Union College in Schenectady and Colgate University in Hamilton, New York. It was a short-lived venture. The University of Deseret only lasted for 3 years, and mainly for economic reasons and the things going on at the time. They were hard scrabbling just to exist, let alone thrive. One of the things I should mention too, if you're looking for topics for a research paper in history or political science, there are a few gems in here you can pick up on. This is one of them, the Deseret Alphabet Primer, because there were a lot of immigrants speaking lots of different languages. So one of the first acts of the University of Deseret and its Board of Regents was to create this little primer that was a phonetic alphabet that was supposed to help people from various languages have a common shared language. Didn't play out. Copies of this you can find online for a few $100, but that was one of the early things the University of Deseret did. The University of Deseret went into hibernation in 1953 for 3 reasons. As I mentioned, the lack of funding, conflict with the indigenous people that lived here, and then the third, and we'll talk about it, is the conflict with the federal government. So for 16 years after 1853, there were just hit and miss intermittent classes taught in the city. Okay, when the Mormons arrived, the Ute Indian tribe was the dominant tribe in the state of Utah, but there were 8 tribes that called Utah home. Like everywhere else, when the white settlers arrived, they crowded out the Native Americans. That's what happened here, and there were 2 wars in Utah to sort that out. The Walker War of the early 1850s and the Black Hawk War in the 1860s. When the Black Hawk War ended, the Utes were removed to the Uinta and Ouray Reservation in eastern Utah, where their tribal headquarters remain today. But the settlers also had trouble with the federal government, and that's the backstory of Fort Douglas. So a little bit of context on why the conflict with the feds. You may never have seen this, but this is a map of what the LDS leaders wish to have as the state of Deseret. It's a very expansive view, as you can see. It's a pretty big place. And they had big ideas for it. And they wanted statehood as soon as they were made a territory, but it ultimately took 50 years. One issue, among several, that statehood wasn't immediately granted, was just the audacity of the sheer size of it. So over a period of decades, it was whittled down to what we know it today, and that continued well into the 1860s, actually. But the 2 real big obstacles to Utah statehood, which relate to the history of Fort Douglas and the U, were theocracy and polygamy. The Mormons didn't want to give up either one, believing that priesthood authority was superior to civil authority. They preferred theocracy at the time, and they considered plural marriage divine, a divinely inspired institution. But the way the territorial government functioned at the time was the ecclesiastical leaders were the civic leaders, top to bottom, in pretty much every office. There was no separation of church and state. Well, as you can imagine, this didn't sit well with the rest of the country. And even before plural marriage was made public in 1852, the federal government was concerned about polygamy. And there were conflicts. President Millard Fillmore initially appointed Brigham Young as the territorial governor, but that became problematic, and subsequent presidents appointed non-Mormon governors and federal justices from outside Utah to come to Utah. Mormons in general, and Brigham Young in particular, didn't like being governed by outsiders and sent many of them packing. This is one example. This is Justice Perry Brockes, who was one of 3 justices that arrived in the Valley in 1851. He was invited to give a talk down on Temple Square in precursor to the Tabernacle, a place called the Bowery, and he lectured the Mormons about their need to be more patriotic and to be more chaste and not have multiple wives. It didn't go well. There was nearly a riot. And when he finished talking, Brigham Young got up and excoriated him, and it kind of went downhill from there. So by the fall, Justice Brockes and the other 2 justices fled the state, went back east, and Brockes was a friend. He was from Virginia. He was a friend of Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, and his experience in Utah and the public announcement of polygamy in 1852 helped poison the well about views of Utah. But things only got worse from there. So a few years later, in the presidential campaign of 1856, there were 3 parties at that time, as you may remember: the Democrats, the Whigs, and the new party, the Republican Party. John C. Fremont and William Dayton were the candidates for the Republican Party that year. They condemned the twin relics of barbarism in their campaign platform. What were the twin relics of barbarism? Slavery and polygamy. That was hardwired into the Republican campaign platform in 1856 and again in 1860. They lost. Who did they lose to? Well, they lost to James Buchanan, and we'll talk about him in a minute. But this was a time when the view outside of Utah, was not favorable. These are a couple of editorial cartoons from that period. They were having a field day with what was called the Mormon problem, and things only got worse, and it reached a tipping point after the election when the federally appointed Chief Justice of Utah Territorial Court entered the fray. I don't have a picture of him, and I wish I did, but you'll have to imagine William W. Drummond. He was a Virginian. He showed up to administer the affairs of the court in Utah in 1856. And with him was a woman not his wife, appropriately named Pleasant Ridgway. And she was described as a young and beautiful adventuress who sometimes joined him on the bench when he was hearing cases. Brigham Young called Drummond a rotten-hearted, loathsome reptile, and their dislike of one another was mutual. At one point, it got so bad, Drummond was placed on house arrest by a local LDS probate judge. Drummond left Utah too. He went back to the States, and when he got there, he sent a letter to President James Buchanan complaining about conditions in Utah. And that got a lot of attention, a lot of traction. Unfortunately, at the same time that was happening, the territorial legislature, disgusted with W.W. Drummond and Pleasant Ridgway, wrote a letter to Congress and to the president saying, come on, send us some better folks out here. We deserve better. Included in their statement was, if Washington continues to appoint office seekers and corrupt demagogues, Utah's citizens will send them away. How did this go down in D.C.? Not well. It was almost seen as a declaration of war and it was not received well at all. So at that point, a chorus of congressmen, ministers, newspapers joined in the call for action. Drummond actually recommended that an armed force be sent to Utah to back up the authority of the federally appointed governors and justices. Poor James Buchanan, newly elected, not wanting to get in the middle of this, but also happy to have attention directed away from slavery for the moment, says, okay, maybe we'll need to do something about it. And without sufficient consultation, he decided that because in his view, Utah was in open rebellion to federal authority, he decided to send 2,500 troops to Utah to back up federal authority under the command of the man you see there, Sidney Albert Johnson, who died not long after in the Civil War. So they come out to Utah to back up the federally appointed officials, and they set up camp. What followed was something called the Utah War. Now, there weren't a lot of people killed in the Utah War. It was a Cold War, but it was a tense war. And one reason trouble was averted was that the camp for the Army was placed 40 miles distance from Salt Lake City. This was a compromise made thanks to the intervention of Thomas Kane. But they decided to place their camp out west of Saratoga Springs. If you can see that map, it's just kind of over the hill from Utah Lake. There's actually a little museum there and a stagecoach stop. It's worth a weekend trip if you're interested. But they set up camp there and basically stayed there until the Civil War began. But there were still conflicts. And at this point, there were conflicts between the troops, the soldiers, the ordinary enlisted men, and the local Mormon people. There were a variety of reasons for that, but one was a lot of the young soldiers took a shine to some of the young Mormon women, and it didn't go down well necessarily. So here's one of them. This guy with the handsome lamb chops is a guy named Sylvester Mowry, a West Point graduate, and he took a liking to a young woman named Marianne Ayers, who was the sister-in-law of Brigham Young Jr. Her husband was off on an LDS mission, but he was pursuing her, and word got out on this, and that wasn't the only reason, but there was a big brawl downtown between the soldiers and the local Mormon boys, and they fought it out. I tell you that story just to give you a feel for the tension even at that level. There's some wonderful quotes in a letter he wrote, but I'll spare you. But at any rate, the Civil War came, and the troops at Camp Floyd vacated the state and removed back to the states to join in the Civil War. Some went for the North, some went for the South. They sold off a lot of their goods. So slavery and the Civil War eclipsed polygamy on the national agenda. But by 1862, Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet became concerned about a few things going on out west that he felt he needed to deal with. One of them was there was still gold being recovered from the mines in California. They needed to get it safely back east to fund the war. They needed safe transport. They didn't want it disappearing along the way from Confederate soldiers or bandits or what have you. They needed to protect those gold shipments. They also needed to protect the overland trails. Part of that for immigrants and part of that for the war effort. But they also felt the need to keep an eye on the Mormons so they didn't get out of hand and potentially even side with the Confederacy. I don't think anyone out here ever thought that, tried to do that, but that fear existed. So, what did Abraham Lincoln do to address this problem? He did two things. One was he appointed Stephen Harding as the territorial governor, an ardent abolitionist from Indiana, and he arrived in Salt Lake City. He was invited to address the local folks down in the Bowery as well. he made a similar mistake as one of his predecessors. He declared his intention to, quote, make treason dumb in Utah, to get you folks in line, get you to understand the feds are in charge here. Brigham Young, again, in the audience, took exception and stood up and defended Utah's patriotism and blamed the federal government for not doing more to protect the Mormons back east before they fled Illinois. He also, not at that time, but later, said of Harding, if you were to fill a sack with cow dung, it would be the best thing you could do for an imitation. So things did not go well with Governor Harding and with Brigham Young. He again left, had bad reports on Utah, which added to the bad reputation. What was the second thing that Lincoln did? Well, he decided he needed to put more federal troops back. And that's when Patrick Edward Connor enters the picture. That's him on your right. So let me tell you about him. He was born on St. Patrick's Day in 1820 in County Derry, Ireland. And as a kid, 16 or 17 years old, he immigrated to the U.S., dropped the O on his name. It was O'Connor, and he became Connor. He joined the U.S. Army, and he went off to join in the Seminole War in Florida. Following that, he was stationed on the frontier in Kansas and Iowa, and then with the Army moved to Texas in 1845, where he joined the Texas Volunteers and fought in the Mexican-American War. When gold was discovered in California in 1849, like a lot of other entrepreneurs, he moved to California, hoping to strike it rich. He didn't strike it rich, but he was a seasoned military veteran, and he and other veterans of the Mexican-American War were enlisted to hunt down outlaws and protect the gold fields and haciendas of Southern California. When the Civil War broke out, he had something called the Stockton Blues. You've heard of Stockton, California. So that's where they were located. He created the Stockton Blues, and his assignment to Utah was to bring the Stockton Blues up to regimental size, and he renamed them the 3rd Regiment of California Volunteers. Now, his troops wanted to get back east and get involved in the Civil War and defeat the Confederacy. But no, they were assigned here and to protect the overland routes and to keep an eye on what was considered to be a festering Mormon rebellion. Okay, here's where the story gets interesting as regards the University of Utah and where we're sitting today. So, Patrick Connor and the 3rd Regiment show up in Utah. They've got to decide where to put their fort, where to put their camp. Where are they going to do it? Well, Salt Lake City, still a village, it wasn't very big, and consisted mainly of what's downtown today. So there was lots of room in the Salt Lake Valley to put a fort. Mormons hoped and thought it would be back out at Camp Floyd behind Saratoga Springs. But Colonel Connor had something else in mind. He chose the foothills east of the city for what was Camp Douglas, later Fort Douglas. So why did he do that? What reasons would he have for putting Fort Douglas in that place? Well, it was close to water. You had to have water for your horses, for your men, for your sawmill, and so forth. Red Butte Creek, that runs not far from where we're sitting. It was close to building materials. You didn't have to go that far to go get pine to build your buildings with. It was right close to the mouth of Immigration Canyon and the immigration trails that were coming. And it was right perched on the hill where you didn't have to put much elevation in your cannon to lob a shell down into Temple Square. Not that they were planning to do that, but you could keep an eye on the Mormons right there, okay? So he chose this spot where we are today on the high ground to create his fort. Well, the camp, which became a fort, was named in honor of Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln's presidential opponent, and he had died just shortly before this. But with this decision in 1862, the future of the University of Utah was guaranteed as far as land to grow on. Certainly, this wasn't his intention. You can't imagine that it would have been his intention. But he arguably made the greatest gift to the University of Utah that anyone has ever made. So let me tell you a little more. This is a later map of Salt Lake City. It's from 1888. But you can see the military reservation there on the right side of that map. Because of the decision Connor made, 10,545 acres of prime real estate were preserved from residential and commercial development. Let that number sink in. The University of Utah occupies about 1,500 acres. This is nearly 10 times that amount. It's a big place. There was the military reservation because it was artillery range and firing range and all of that. So eventually, this area proved to be the site for the University of Utah and several other important Utah institutions that I'll mention later. So what he preserved by staking this claim of land in 1862, and you can kind of tell by looking at the map, although it's small for you to see perhaps, everything east of University Street, right? Down below Present Circle. Everything east up into the hilltops, and everything as far north as you could go, up Virginia Avenue, up past the Shriners and so forth, all the way down to 900 South. All of that was the Fort Douglas Military Reservation. So I would say before we move on, Connor disliked both Indians and Mormons, made no distinction, didn't like either one of them, was responsible for the Bear River Massacre and other troubles when he was here. But he did do this wonderful thing for the University of Utah, and that's why I pointed this particular out. But his troops also enjoyed sticking a thumb in the eye of the LDS Church and its leadership. So what's a good way to do that? Well, a former editor of the Salt Lake Tribune could tell you it might be to start a newspaper. And that's what they did at Camp Douglas. They started something called the Union Vedette. Whoop, sorry. In 1863, a year after they got here, they published the first daily newspaper in Utah Territory, the Union Vedette. Now, the LDS Church published the weekly Deseret News. It's still around, daily now, digital mostly. But its stated mission of the Union Vedette was to, quote, serve their country by devoting their time, talent, and energy to the propagation of loyal sentiment and the development of regenerated Utah. Now, in Virginia City, the Virginia City newspaper put it more plainly. They said the Union Vedette is a thorn in the side of Mormonism. It is the enemy of polygamy, and the effects of its broadsides are beginning to be seen and felt. So there was tension between the soldiers, the troops, and the local people. But this huge plot of land was protected and preserved. Another very important contribution Connor made to the development of Utah was the discovery of mineral wealth, because the soldiers under his command spent a lot of time looking for precious metals. They found them. Kennecott Copper Mine grew out of that. Over in Tintic and Eureka and that area west, Park City, a lot of the mineral wealth in the area was found initially by Connor's troops. And that began to change things both economically, politically, and socially as you had more people come in, miners and others. Fortunes were made, big fortunes were made in the mining business. And if you walk or drive or ride however you get around South Temple, you can see the mansions built by the people who made their fortunes in the mining industry that was created growing out of these discoveries. Well, following the Civil War, Patrick Connor gave up his command of Fort Douglas, but he stayed in Utah. He chose to stay here. He hoped to make a fortune in mining. He didn't, but he made a living. He established the little town of Stockton in Rush Valley, south of Tooele, He lived out his life here, and if you want to go for a walk of discovery, you can go up to the old cemetery in Fort Douglas. You can see a monument in his honor, and he is buried there today. Now, back to the University of Deseret, and then I'll bring these stories together. So, with the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865 and the completion of the Transcontinental Railway in 1869, things were looking up in Utah. Relations with the federal government were stable, not ideal, but they were stable. The economy was strengthening, and the University of Deseret came out of hibernation. Went into hibernation in 1853, came out of hibernation in 1869. That year, the Board of Regents hired John R. Park as president. He was a graduate of Ohio Wesleyan University and NYU, and he became the intellectual father of the University of Utah and brought it further along. He spent a couple of years touring Europe, looking at models of European universities upon which to base the model for the University of Deseret, as it was still called at the time. He returned hoping to lay the foundation for what would eventually become a great university. Well, that bold vision was initially housed in modest accommodations. This is a picture of South Temple and Main Street, kind of looking to the northwest. The building on the corner there, you can see, is the council house, and that's where the classes were held initially. It was also home for the territorial legislature. It was also home for the LDS leadership. Remember, theocracy, no distinction, church and state. They were all there together in that building. But things were going well enough by 1875 that the University of Deseret, at the direction of its Board of Regents, established the Timpanogos branch campus in Provo. They called it the Brigham Young Academy. We know it today as Brigham Young University, but it began as a branch campus of the University of Deseret. During the 1870s, things were looking up for Fort Douglas as well. At that time, they only had wooden buildings, and they were giving way and wearing out. So the soldiers at the camp quarried the red sandstone stone that's found in Red Butte Canyon and built the red sandstone buildings that you see on President's Circle today. That happened during that time. Mount Olivet Cemetery, just south of the stadium, was created at that time too. But in 1853, disaster struck. That building burned to the ground along with about half the block. A photographer's studio was next door, and he had a lot of highly flammable material, and the whole thing went up. So they had to find another place for a home for the University of Deseret. As quickly as they could, they moved to Union Square. Where is Union Square, you ask? How many of you know where West High School is in Salt Lake City, down by the Gateway? That block where West High School is was Union Square. And that's where the Union Academy building sits. It was originally a hotel. It served as a kind of a high school, middle school, high school for a time. But it was converted to the University of Deseret during this time. Now, Joan R. Park knew there needed to be a better home for the university than this little building on University Square. And so the Utah Territorial Legislature appropriated the funds and built this stately looking building. That was the home of the University of Deseret for many years. And it no longer stands. It would that it did. It's a beautiful old building. By 1886, the university was granting its first degrees. An alumni association was organized, and the territorial library was transferred to the university in 1890. You had three options if you came to the University of Deseret: a 4-year course in classical studies, a 3-year course in scientific studies, or a 2-year normal course, normal being the term for a teaching degree, a teaching certificate. That's where you could study here. Student life began to emerge. There were literary and debating societies, a literary magazine, and an annual university ball. But in the 1880s, there were other troubles going on. I'll refer to them briefly. The federal government was still trying to bring the LDS Church to heel and to give up theocracy and to give up polygamy. They passed laws that basically ratcheted up the pressure. Polygamous men were fined and imprisoned, which put a lot of the leadership of all of the civic organizations in jail. And it reached the point that the federal government was beginning to seize all of the finances and material goods owned by the LDS Church. To save the church, LDS President Wilford Woodruff issued what was known as the 1890 Manifesto to save the church from ruin, and it gave up polygamy, turned a corner for statehood for Utah. So, John R. Park, in his later years, here you see him with the last graduating class of the University of Deseret. This is the class of 1892. Of note to our story today, as a part of Utah's bid for statehood, the name of the university was changed to the University of Utah in 1892. That same year, the university established another branch campus, this time in Cedar City. It was called the Branch Normal School. Today it's Southern Utah University. But by this time, John R. Park's health was declining, and he wanted to see the future of the university preserved, if possible, in his lifetime. He knew Union Square wasn't going to do the job. He knew there had to be another place. So where do you cite the university? Well, you know, because you're here. Take another look at the map. Well, what do you see on the east side of town? Same thing he saw. Vacant land. He hoped to relocate the university on the East Bench. And with that in mind, he began making the case with the territorial legislature and the governor and anyone that would listen to persuade a gift of land that would allow the university to get a toehold up here on the East Bench. The territorial legislature, with help from Utah's sole territorial representative, a man named John T. Kane, petitioned Congress for a grant of land for the new campus. And hopes were high, but a lot of people in Washington were not sure they wanted to do any favor for the folks in Utah. It took a little while, and Utah had to go through 5 different drafts of its state constitution to get one that was finally acceptable to Congress. But they finally did. They got a constitution that was acceptable, that made clear a distinction between church and state, separated things. And Utah was granted statehood in 1896. Then, what war was America in shortly thereafter? The Spanish-American War. Teddy Roosevelt, the Raiders and so forth. So when that war ended, Congress finally granted 60 acres of Fort Douglas land to the state for the campus of the University of Utah. It was the first of what would be many other gifts of land from Fort Douglas. It took a little while to get going. They had very modest things to begin with. This is a photo taken in 1912, showing construction of one of the buildings on President's Circle. But if you look behind it up to the hill, you'll see a couple of things. One is you'll see a lot of vacant land between there and Fort Douglas, because it was just artillery range and firing range at the time. The other thing you'll see is the little Block U up on the hill. That kind of amazed me when I found this photo. They got that Block U up there in a hurry. But let's take a look at what was going on at Fort Douglas at this time as well. Here's a view of Fort Douglas looking to the east, taken from about where we're sitting, by my reckoning. It's just kind of looking right up that way, from about here or near here. So there was lots of land available. In 1898, as I mentioned, with the Spanish-American War, the troops at Fort Douglas were mobilized and they went into the war, and they fought nobly in it. One of the more notable units was the 24th Infantry, composed of African-American soldiers. And they fought courageously in Cuba, including charging up San Juan Hill. In 1904, after the war, Congress granted 32 more acres of Fort Douglas to the University of Utah. I'm going to move a little quicker here to give time for discussion if you want it. During World War I, several things happened. The campus was used as part of preparation for the civilian training. Between 4,000 and 5,000 recruits got training at Fort Douglas before being shipped off to Europe. You see the soldiers in front of the park building there on the left. Those are German POWs on the right. About 300 German prisoners of war were incarcerated at the fort, as well as a few hundred conscientious objectors, held behind barbed wire fence, where a few successfully escaped. More on that later. Well, more on that now. After the war, after World War I, relations were a little strained for a variety of reasons between the fort and the city. And to improve relations with the city, the commander of the fort agreed to provide labor, horses, and equipment if civilians would raise funds for seed, pipe, and sprinkler so that a golf course could be built on Fort Douglas land. For the officers of Fort Douglas, for the good citizens of Salt Lake City, and they built a little course house where now the JCC sits. But all of that land, and it was the full 18-hole golf course, became a land bank because it was ultimately transferred to the University of Utah too. This new computer science building going in right over here, that was on the golf course. Pretty much everything you're seeing in the immediate adjacency here was part of that land. It's a land bank that's been used for athletic fields, public broadcasting, parking, research buildings, the computer building. The clubhouse attached to the golf course became the Fort Douglas Country Club until 1997, when the local Jewish community purchased it. It's now the Jewish Community Center. Okay, 1922. Here's a look at campus. New buildings, athletic stadium, and other things you see. It's called President's Circle, as you know, but it's kind of like a horseshoe, right? In the early days, it was actually a circle. It was a full-on circle, and you can kind of see that in this picture. And in the 1930s, Congress transferred an additional 61 acres from the fort. New buildings included a field house, now the Meldrum Theater, and a central library, now the Crocker Science Center. And by the 1940s, there was a full curriculum being taught at the university, including the School of Medicine, teaching in one of the buildings down on President's Circle. During World War II, there's a photo there on your left, soldiers having chow in the basement of Gardner Hall. And on the right, that's more German POWs brought to Utah during the war. So during the war, World War II, it became the military center for the 9th Service Command. It was moved from San Francisco, deemed to be a safer place in Salt Lake City. Personnel repaired tens of thousands of vehicles, small arms, artillery, and other machinery. A lot of tanks and so forth were worked on here, and a lot of training went on. Male students were required to take military science and tactic courses and other military courses. And following the war, the university acquired even more land from Fort Douglas. Until very recently, there were vestiges of World War II buildings in use on campus. How many of you here remember the annex building up by the basketball arena? Just a couple. So it was used until very, very recently, the annex, and that was part of that. The old police building, I think it's gone now with the new police headquarters. There's, I think, one or two left. One of them is where the motor pool is, just across from the LDS Institute. That was built during the war. Of interest, how many of you like to hike the foothills? Any of you? Okay, here's a tip for you. Much of what is Research Park today was a firing range, which later had to be cleaned up, and because it was home to troops that fought in the Indian Wars and the battlefields of the Civil War and in Europe and Asia and Cuba and the Middle East. They left behind a lot of debris. And if you look where the water runs, if you're up behind the Natural History Museum or Huntsman corporate headquarters and so forth, you'll find these slugs. These are a couple I picked out, but you have to keep it out an eagle eye, but there are a lot of them up there you can find when you're hiking around. And there was a lot of stuff laying around. This map's a little hard for you to see, but bear with me. In 2015, Congress appropriated funds to clean up this site, and this map shows you the site. The green line is the approximate original boundary of Fort Douglas, the military reservation. The red line is the impact area where weapons were fired. The purple dotted line is where artillery was fired, and the red dotted line is where small arms were fired. So there was a lot of stuff going on here, and there's still remnants of that around. No, I'm not aware of any live armaments found, but you find a lot of the slugs. After the war, more land was transferred to the fort, and 49 acres of the mouth of Immigration Canyon were transferred to the Utah Pioneer Trails Landmark Association. This is the Place State Park. In 1945, land was given to the Shriners for the hospital. In 1948, land was given to the Veterans Administration for their hospital. And 299 more acres were transferred to the U in 1948. The National Guard got all that land just east of Mount Olivet on Guardsman Way. That was where the Guard was for a long time. Salt Lake City acquired that triangular piece between the VA hospital and the Huntsman Center. The LDS Church owns it now. The church got it from the city. But that all happened after the war. More recently, the medical campus in the 1960s, land was given for the medical campus. That's a photo from 1964. And in 1968, 2 more huge chunks of land were transferred from Fort Douglas. Hundreds of acres of Red Butte watershed were transferred to the U.S. Forest Service. That's looking up that canyon where that reservoir is. 600 acres were transferred to the state of Utah. Of that 600, 100 acres were set aside to create the state arboretum, Red Butte Garden. 180 acres were given to expand. This is the Place State Park. And when the dust settled, at that point, of the 10,545 acres, only 119 acres remained of Fort Douglas after that. Now, of the 600 acres that was transferred to the state, 320 acres southeast of campus were set aside that would be, and continue to this day, be very important for the future of the university. It's Research Park. We know it as Research Park. Ray Alpin, top left, was the president of the university. He and his aides made a case to build something modeled on Stanford's University Research Park. The city and the state agreed with it. They set aside that land for it. And the Research Park began in a modest way, but has grown tremendously. And it is actually today one of the most significant land banks left. I'd give a shout out to the Democrats. This was the day when Lyndon Johnson was president. Cal Ramsden was a Democratic governor. Ted Moss was a Democratic senator. Morris Udall was the Secretary of the Interior, but they pulled together to get the 600 acres of the state of Utah. What's happened since in Research Park? Well, it's been home for defense contractors like BioFire and Sarcos and others. It's increasingly home to university health sciences entities like the Orthopedic Hospital, School of Dentistry, ARUP, home to the Red Butte Garden, Natural History Museum, and very significant. So, I'm going to sprint to the end here. Fort Douglas in the 20th century. So near the turn of the century, Fort Douglas was placed on closure status. That was in 1991. 51 more acres were transferred to the university in anticipation of the Olympic Winter Games. That's how we got the housing up at the Heritage Center and in Fort Douglas. That came as a result of that. At that point, Fort Douglas became the headquarters for the 96th Army Reserve Command and a base of operations for the U.S. Navy and Marines Reserve. As preparations for the 2002 Winter Olympics got underway, millions and millions and millions of dollars were raised in order to restore these old buildings, in order to build all of the new housing at Sage Point and all of the other places up there. Huge improvement. I predict the 2034 Olympics we'll see a similar boost of facilities on campus. This is when we got our tracks line up here too, was during the Olympics. In 2002, during the Winter Olympics, nearly 500 acres of the land previously given to the university was placed in a conservation easement. We call it the Heritage Preserve, to protect in perpetuity the land up behind the museum and Red Butte Garden and the medical complex. What's the future of Research Park? I don't know. This is one speculative idea of what could happen. But it's this huge land bank because the people that are, the businesses that are there, they don't own the land. They own the building. They're 25-year leases. When the leases are up, that's how the medical facilities got on there. So over time, I predict this will become home for other educational buildings, for housing, for a variety of things. But it's this tremendous gift of land that will be very, very helpful. As was mentioned in the introduction, the final chapter of the Fort Douglas University of Utah story is being written now. Thanks to the effort of President Randall, and I'm sorry he's not here, but Jason Perry, who've worked years to get it done, the remaining 50 acres of Fort Douglas will be transferred to the University of Utah as soon as the new center out at Camp Williams is built. And it's been quite a run. And I would say in conclusion that we're indebted, we, the University of Utah, are indebted to Fort Douglas, and more specifically, Patrick Edward Connor, for a decision made in 1862 that has created the opportunity we have seen happen. We ought to build a statue to it. Well, they did. It's up there by the Military Museum. And then it's John R. Park. You know, there are 2 alcoves at the Park building. I don't think I'm going to launch a campaign to do it, but there's an argument could be made for Patrick Connor to be in that other alcove because of the land that we've got here. So next time you pass the Park building or the Military Museum, you can tip your hat to Colonel Connor or to John R. Park. That's it. And we're about out of time, but any quick questions before you go? And if you need to go, go. But if
We'll take a mic right here to this questions.
Do you know when the Block U photo was put up? Because I was pretty surprised it was up there too in that photo.
The which?
Cool. The Block U photo on the hill.
Well, I'm sure that's a good research project, by the way. I don't know, but it was certainly by 1912. So I'm sure there's a story behind that, but I've never heard it. I don't know it.
Oh, very cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Jay's got one.
Is there any pushback on Connor getting the statue because of Bear River?
Yes, he's a controversial figure because of the Bear River Massacre particularly. And yeah, it's a mixed legacy, right? I'm tongue-in-cheek saying a statue ought to be in front of the Park building, but because I doubt that it would ever happen. But yeah, it would be a very controversial thing.
What I understand too, I think John R. Park was singing it too.
He was. And he gave all of his personal library to create the foundation of the University of Utah Library. He was also, in his contract, given the right to graze his cow on the circle in front of the Park building. Yeah, he was a single dude. True.
Any other questions?
Okay.
No, I'm curious too. I hadn't done, is that okay real quick?
I suppose, yeah. Last question,
What
sure.
was Colonel Parker's interaction with Brother Young, with Brigham Young? Did they?
Colonel Connor?
Patrick Connor.
Well, I don't know.
Did they know each other?
Oh yeah, of course. And they didn't like one another. Yeah, I don't know that they ever met face to face, but no, there was mutual antagonism. Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I hope there was something there of potential interest to you.
Thank you all so much. Please join me in thanking our speaker.